Daniel Horns is a professor of geology and an associate dean of the College of Science and Health at Utah Valley University. He earned his Bachelor's of Science in Geophysics from UCLA and a PhD in Geology from UC Davis. His teaching and research focus on assessment of earthquake and landslide hazards. Dr. Horns uses his expertise in geologic hazards, water resources, and groundwater pollution to teach his students and the public at large about the interactions between geology and society. So we will turn the time over to Dr. Horns.
Thank you. So I'm partly winging this because we couldn't get my computer hooked up to the monitor here. So the title of the talk is supposed to be "A Big Earthquake is Coming to Utah Valley. We don't know when, but it doesn't matter." And so I want to talk following those three statements as an outline. Big earthquake is coming to Utah Valley. Item number one. There has been no historical large earthquakes directly in Utah Valley at all. Largest earthquake historically here is about a magnitude 4, 4.5, right up in Jordan Narrows area. I don't remember exactly when that is, when that was. When we think about earthquake hazards here in Utah, there's one fault that dominates the conversation, which is what? The Wasatch Fault. So not only has there not been a large earthquake in Utah Valley in historical time, and when I say historical time, I mean since Europeans arrived, since pioneers arrived here, there's been no earthquake directly attributable to the Wasatch Fault. So we make this big stink about the Wasatch Fault and about earthquake preparedness, despite the complete lack of historical earthquake activity on the Wasatch Fault. So I just want to get that out up front. On the PowerPoint, my first goal was to show you the evidence that there have been large earthquakes on the Wasatch Fault prior to any written record in this area, and maybe as recently as a couple hundred years ago. And here's how we know that the Wasatch Fault is capable of producing earthquakes. Piece of evidence number one is the fact that in this part of the world, the crust of the earth is being deformed. So this is a map of obviously Utah Lake, the Wasatch Mountains. The yellow line here is the Wasatch Fault. And when I say the crust of the earth is being deformed, I mean this part of the world is stretching roughly east-west by 1 to 2 millimeters per year. Doesn't sound very impressive, right? 1 to 2 millimeters per year. This is actually measured. This is observational fact. This is not anyone's theory. This is measured with highly precise GPS, Global Positioning System. Bob Smith up at the University of Utah set up a system of benchmarks around here, and through very careful GPS measurements has documented 1 to 2 millimeters per year of stretching between the east side of the Wasatch Range and the west side of the Wasatch Front Valleys. 1 to 2 millimeters per year, not a big deal. What if you have 1 millimeter per year over 1,000 years? Now how much stretching have you accumulated? That's a meter of stretching. Okay, a meter of stretching in 1,000 years, if it's 2 millimeters per year, and this is, you know, the data are not accurate within a millimeter, but it's somewhere between 1 and 2 millimeters per year. 2 millimeters per year means 2 meters of stretching in 1,000 years. So if we had 2 meters of stretching across the Utah Valley in 1,000 years, that is capable of producing a significant earthquake. How does that produce an earthquake? The crust of the earth, when we try to stretch the crust of the earth, we're stretching it, let's pretend this is east-west stretching, the crust doesn't simply open up and form a big gap. Instead, I have to somehow make these poster boards take up more space side to side without opening up a gap. What can I do to these poster boards to make them take up more space side to side and not open a gap between them? Yeah, I see a few people rotating your hands. Look at that. So as these boards rotate, they are effectively stretching horizontally, but not opening a gap. Let's go back to this configuration. Do we have a valley or a mountain range? Where? No. As these blocks of crust rotate, they create a valley in the mountain range. So this rotation of the blocks of the crust of the earth are what create the mountains, what create the valleys, but this slip does not happen smoothly. Instead, this 1 to 2 millimeters per year of stretching is stored as bending of the blocks, and they bend. The more they bend, let me do it this way. The more they bend, the more strain builds up in the crust, till suddenly the stresses overcome friction on the fault and the fault will slip. So if there was suddenly 2 meters of slip on this break between these two blocks, which is what we call the fault, 2 meters of slip is what we expect out of an earthquake of about magnitude 7. So we know through measurements that there's 1 to 2 millimeters per year of slip along the, of stretching here. 1 to 2 millimeters per year can generate 2 meters of slip in 1 to 2,000 years, which could generate a magnitude 7 earthquake about once every 1,000 to 2,000 years. Okay, so the fact that the crust is stretching, that's one way we know that there's a potential for earthquake hazards here. And what I just said, an earthquake once every 1 to 2,000 years, that's not the number you hear often. That would be just for one section of the Wasatch Fault. The Wasatch Fault, we think, behaves in a series of segments. If we look at all of those segments together, we expect earthquakes more frequently than once every 1 to 2,000 years. Okay, so because the crust is being deformed, we think there's a potential for earthquakes here. If we dig trenches along the Wasatch Fault and look at the layers of soil, we see in those layers of soil evidence of prehistoric earthquakes. And I would show you pictures of that, but I'm not able to. And there's a particular phenomenon that happens when the Wasatch Fault ruptures, and we suddenly generate a little cliff face there. And that cliff face will erode, and the soil from the eroded cliff face accumulates at the bottom of the cliff face. It creates a really distinctive deposit of sediment that we call a colluvial wedge. So when we are digging trenches across the Wasatch Fault, we're looking for these distinctive deposits of sediment called colluvial wedges. If we find one, often the only way to explain the presence of this little wedge-shaped deposit of sediment is from sudden slip on the fault. So that's the other reason we say, geologists say with certainty, there is potential for earthquakes on the Wasatch Fault. The crust is actively being deformed, and we have these colluvial wedges showing us that there have been earthquakes in the past. And when we look at the sizes of those colluvial wedges, they are consistent with about 2 meters of slip on the fault. So that's the first part. A big earthquake is coming to Utah Valley. The second part, we don't know when. When I tell people I'm an earthquake geologist, inevitably the first question is, when's the big one coming? My response is always, I don't know when, and anyone who tells you they do know is a quack, and don't listen to them. So there is this figure that probably some of you have seen. This is the Wasatch Fault in red here, different segments of the Wasatch Fault. Here's the Provo segment from the point of the mountain down to Payson, Salt Lake City segment, Nephi segment, and so on. And every one of these red bullseye type things is the approximate timing of a prehistoric earthquake. And this is today, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago, going back in time. So if you look at this for the Provo segment, it looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 earthquakes in the last 6,000 years. Let's see, so that's one earthquake every 1,200 years, pretty similar to what I said. Oh, so we ought to be able to tell. 5 earthquakes in 6,000 years, that's once every 1,200 years. So the last one was, looks like 300 years ago. We should be good for the next 700 years. Good, okay, let's all go home. No. Earthquakes don't happen as regular periodic phenomena. They just don't. The Earth system here is so complicated that sometimes a fault will go much longer than average without an earthquake, sometimes much shorter. And the best example of that is here on the Weber segment. These two earthquakes were clustered only about 250 years apart, following almost 1,000-year gap of no earthquake activity. So this chart, I like to think of it as showing that there's been a lot of earthquakes, something like 22 earthquakes in the last 6,000 years on these segments of the fault. But beyond that, there's not much significant you can get out of this. This chart doesn't show you when to expect the next earthquake or on which segment to expect the next earthquake. You would think Brigham City because it's been the longest, but that may not be the case. So the Earth system is super complicated. That's one reason we can't say when the next one will be. Another reason we can't say when the next one will be is just the fact that these ages are approximate. So this one looks like it was 300 years ago. If you actually look at the data that said 300 years ago, 300 is the best estimate. But it could have been as little as right before the pioneers got here, or it might have been as much as 600 years ago. We just don't even know exactly when it was. So even if the Earth system was a very simple system where earthquakes happened on regular periods, we can't say exactly when the last one was. We can say within a couple hundred years, but that's the best we can do. So an earthquake is coming to Utah Valley. We don't know when. That's the first two parts of the talk. This is going much faster than it would have if I had all the pictures. So then the third part of the talk is, but it doesn't care. It doesn't matter. Why doesn't it matter? Here's some statistics for you. And anytime I'm trying to pull numbers out of my head is dangerous. I don't remember numbers well. But a few earthquakes that were about the size of earthquake we expect here. We expect the largest earthquake produced on the Wasatch Fault to be about magnitude 7, maybe up to 7.4 or so. That's based on how much the fault appears to slip, maybe as much as 3 meters, and the length of the rupture, which is maybe up to 60 kilometers. And if we compare that with historical earthquakes other places, 3 meters of slip over 60 kilometers, that gets you up to about a magnitude 7.4. So let's think of some earthquakes in the recent past around the world that have had about that same magnitude. Most recent one, about 4 years ago in Haiti. Remember that Haiti earthquake? And here's where my lack of being able to remember numbers is going to hurt me. I don't remember the casualty toll from the Haiti earthquake. I think it was 22,000 people died. Okay, going back in time, in the year 1990, there was an earthquake in Soviet Armenia. That was about magnitude 7. At the time it was Soviet Armenia, now it's just Armenia. The people there are happy about that. About magnitude 7, 25,000 people died. Trying to remember my chart there. One more, oh, Turkey, east of Istanbul. And that was in 1999, about magnitude 7. And in that earthquake, my memory is 2,500 people died. So if we look at those three examples, Armenia, Turkey, and Haiti, magnitude 7 earthquakes, the casualty toll ranged from about 2,000 to about 20,000. All of those are scary. Here's why it doesn't have to matter that an earthquake of about that size is coming here. 1989 World Series earthquake, anyone remember that one? Was anyone watching the World Series at the time? I was not watching the World Series at the time. I was actually a graduate student at UC Davis laying on my couch reading a scientific paper about the earthquake faults of the Santa Cruz Mountains, true story. And I felt this low frequency rumbling, and I thought, ooh, there's an earthquake. And it was very low frequency, so I knew it was far away. My wife was 2 weeks overdue with our first child. She was in the bathtub and she thought, oh, nausea. But it was the low frequency rumbling. Anyway, that World Series earthquake, about magnitude 7, 64 people died. Northridge, 1994, about magnitude 7. I didn't experience that earthquake. My memory of that one was around 20 people died. So what's the difference between 2,000 to 20,000 deaths and a couple dozen deaths? Construction. There's a saying we have in earthquake geology, earthquakes don't kill people, falling buildings kill people. That's why it doesn't have to matter that we have this earthquake coming. Because if we are prepared, then we don't have to fear as much as we otherwise would. That's the good news. So the good news is if you are living in or working in a building that meets modern earthquake code, you're okay. So there's one of the take-home messages. It's not likely to be a life safety issue for you. There will be issues you need to worry about. Comfort issues following the earthquake, having food and water, getting a hold of your family, things like that. But life safety is not going to be a huge concern if you live or work in a building that meets modern code. That's the good news. Here's the bad news. And I'm again having to remember numbers here. California, roughly 10 times the population of Utah, has about 2,000 buildings that don't meet modern earthquake codes. Utah, 1/10 the population of California, has about 30,000 buildings that don't meet modern earthquake code. And the buildings that don't meet modern earthquake code, for the most part, we call them unreinforced masonry buildings. Brick. Unreinforced masonry is a long way of saying brick. Here in the United States, it's mostly brick. If you live in a house that's unreinforced masonry, it's probably not a life safety issue. I live in such a house. And I have no doubt that if there was a large earthquake, my house wouldn't be livable anymore, but I would be alive. Because 1 to 2 story unreinforced masonry buildings, they don't typically catastrophically collapse and completely pancake. They usually just suffer some significant fractures, partial collapse. If you're in there, you're okay. If you feel strong shaking, dive under something or next to something that's strong. Roll out of bed, get as close to under bed as you can, dive under your desk, whatever. Don't try to run outside. So you might see in the coming months a lot of publicity around the unreinforced masonry issue here in Utah. And it is an issue for larger buildings that are composed of unreinforced masonry. These are a lot of apartment buildings for the most part that exist in the older areas of Provo and Salt Lake City. And that's where most of these 30,000 buildings are. Anyway, so that's putting a little bit of fear out there. Yeah, question?
The reason why you need to dive under is because pieces of the building may come on you.
Yes.
And if you go outside, pieces of other buildings may come on you. Is that...
So So the question was the reason you want to roll under your bed or dive under your desk. Because the biggest hazard, if we're not worried about whole building collapse, which we're mostly not, unless we're in a multi-story unreinforced masonry building, if that's not our concern, we still need to be concerned about little chunks falling off. Lamps falling, bookcases falling, refrigerators, stereo speakers. I say that because in a moderate earthquake in Mammoth Lakes, I watched a stereo speaker tumble down and take out one of my albums. Things like that. Also, so there's these things that can hurt you and probably not kill you. if you're trying to run outside, you're likely going to injure yourself because during strong ground shaking, it's hard to run. You're better off just huddling underneath. If you're in a downtown area where there's going to be a lot of windows breaking, then the falling glass is going to be a hazard of its own.
Wouldn't the door also be wedged closed because of the...
Well, yeah, the old line used to be stand in a doorway because the door frame creates some protection, but doors swing and hurt people. Yeah, so yeah, the doors would swing during shaking. So again, the title of the talk is A Big Earthquake is Coming to Utah Valley. We don't know when, but it doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter because if we're prepared, it really doesn't matter exactly when that's going to hit. And rather than trying to tell you everything you need to know about preparing, I would just refer you to the State Department of Emergency Management has put together a lot of preparedness guides. And I have them over at a table over there. I have them up here. And there's things to think about. Of course, there's food and water, and most people around here have food and water pretty well covered. But there's other things to help your personal safety. Thanks, Reagan. Flashlights, things like that. Having a family communication plan so you can get in touch with your loved ones. Have a designated out-of-state phone number that you all call. That's key, because in-state calls will be tied up. It's easier to call to out-of-state if there's an earthquake here. And rather than, like I said, rather than running over all of them, I will invite you to pick up some of these plans here. There's also tips on how to prepare your home for earthquake safety. Number one tip is, of course, anyone know? Tie it down. If your home is not tied to the foundation, that's it. Then also tying down your water heater. Your water heater needs to be strapped to something, to a beam or something, because water heaters will tip over. Most of them are gas fired. If the gas line breaks, then you've created a major fire hazard.
Even if you don't have water storage, you've got the water in your water heater to use, so you'll have water for several days.
Everyone hear that? So we all have water in our water heater that we could use if the water heater is strapped to the wall and hasn't burned as a water source. Yeah, people need to get resourceful. So I have those preparedness guides here and back at the table. I also have this document that was put together by the Utah Seismic Safety Commission and the Utah Geological Survey and others called Putting Down Roots in Earthquake Country, which has in it a lot of information on the Wasatch Fault. Like the document I just showed you, it looks slightly different because it's been updated. The poster I just showed you is updated. It's got that information on geologically why we have an earthquake hazard here, plus a lot of preparedness information in it. And so you can pick this up, or you can just, if you just Google Putting Down Roots in Earthquake Country, Utah, you can get a PDF version of this. And lastly, I'll just make a little pitch. As I was introduced, I'm a professor of geology over at UVU. I also represent an organization called In Harm's Way. And In Harm's Way is an organization that is devoted to protecting people from the dangers of natural hazards through education. And In Harm's Way has two major efforts. One is going to Utah schools. We go and educate school kids about these issues and give them materials that they can take home and help their families. And the other is working in the country of Indonesia. And the reason for that is the person who founded In Harm's Way, Ron Harris, he's a geology professor at BYU. He was studying the geology of Indonesia, and he recognized a high probability of an earthquake without predicting it, saying there's a good chance of an earthquake in this section of Sumatra coming up. Tried to warn the Indonesian government, and that didn't work because they don't have a good functional government in Indonesia. And then that 2004 earthquake hit, which generated the tsunami, which killed 250,000 people. In response to that, Ron decided to switch his focus from studying the geology of earthquakes to educating people about earthquake hazards. And we run expeditions to Indonesia most years to go out to the areas that we think have the highest probability of tsunami generating earthquakes in the near future and train people how high up on the shoreline the tsunamis are likely to come, where they should evacuate to, and other earthquake related issues. So I've got some pamphlets on In Harm's Way as well. Question there.
It might be kind of silly, but someone is. I've heard that if there was an earthquake, that the dams would break.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Would the dams break during an earthquake? Deer Creek Dam was retrofit. The retrofit finished about 3 years ago or so. That's because it was in danger of catastrophic failure during an earthquake from a phenomenon known as liquefaction, where there's got sandy soils inside the dam. These soils are intended to allow water to flow through, so any water that seeps into the dam flows through the sandy soils, then out along the river. The way the dam was initially designed was bad, and those sandy layers were creating liquefaction hazards so that the whole earthen dam could have catastrophically failed. It was retrofit, and it should be good now. Jordanelle Reservoir was built when these issues were understood, and it should be fine. So I wouldn't feel bad about living along the Provo River floodplain from that perspective. If the dams did fail during an earthquake, which would surprise me, I don't think they would fail catastrophically. It would be a failure over the course of at least several hours, if not several days. It's not like a thin arch dam that can fail in a matter of seconds. Yeah, so that's a good question. Will the waters of the lake be displaced? Yes. There's two reasons for that. One is the shaking itself can set up a wave in a body of standing water. The wave is called a seiche, and it's not a tsunami. It's a different phenomenon, but within a lake or a swimming pool, you'll see the water just sloshing back and forth. You can see that from that recent earthquake in Nepal. There's video of seiches in swimming pools. So that's one reason that there would be water displaced in the lakes. So any construction right along the lake could be impacted. Another reason gets back to this old idea. So the earthquake happens, Utah Valley suddenly drops, on the east side of the valley, drops a couple meters. What happens to the east shore of the lake? It won't be 2 meters of drop because the 2 meters will be right on the mountain front, but it could be half a meter of drop of the east shore of the lake. So what's now a meter above lake level suddenly is at water level. So that's a concern, that there'll be general eastward tilting of the valley, which would impact issues along the lake. Here's a little aside. The amount of tilting could be enough that any man-made systems that are designed to depend on only 1 degree of slope going towards the west might not work anymore. What man-made structures depend on 1 degree of slope? Sewers. Yeah.
Last question.
You said only a quack could predict an earthquake.
Yep.
I remember a few weeks ago, there were 2 straight days of headlines about huge Bay Area earthquake, imminent, coming. Like, what was going on? Just your moment?
It was a quack.
Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't Bay Area, it's LA. Yeah, so I looked into the background of that guy, and there's a lot of people who say they predict earthquakes, and anytime there is an earthquake, someone will say, I predicted that. If you go and look at their record, they've probably predicted 50 earthquakes in the last year, and then they got it right once, so they say they got it. Coincidentally, that prediction came out the day before the movie San Andreas was released, and those might be related.